I didn't go to therapy because I wanted to change who I was. I went because I couldn't breathe inside myself anymore. Every morning felt like waking up in someone else's life, wearing a name and posture that fit me on paper but never on my skin. I told myself it was stress, work pressure, expectations, the noise of everyone needing me to be stable, strong, predictable. But the truth was quieter and heavier. I felt hollow, like I had been edited down to a version that was easier for the world to accept. My therapist noticed it before I ever said it. The pauses. The way my hands twisted together when I talked about childhood. The way my voice dropped when I said I'm fine. One afternoon, after weeks of circling the same thoughts, she leaned back and asked a question that didn't sound dangerous at first. Who were you when no one was watching? I laughed it off, made a joke, but my chest tightened. Because I knew the answer scared me. The session that changed everything started like any other. Same room. Same soft light. Same chair that always felt too firm, like it was reminding me to sit correctly. We talked about control, about masks, about how survival sometimes teaches us to erase parts of ourselves. Then she said something that made my heart pound so loudly I was sure she could hear it. I want to try a therapeutic roleplay today. My mind raced. Roleplay sounded childish, harmless. She explained it wasn't acting, it was exploration. A safe container. A way to let the body speak when words fail. She asked me to stand. That alone felt strange. I was used to shrinking in that room, not taking up space. She walked to a small cabinet I had never paid attention to before. When she opened it, my breath caught. Inside were clothes. Simple ones. Soft fabrics. Neutral colors. Nothing flashy. Nothing theatrical. But unmistakably not meant for the version of me I showed the world. My first instinct was to apologize, to say this was a mistake, that I wasn't that kind of person. But my legs wouldn't move. She didn't rush me. She said something that still echoes in my head. This isn't about becoming someone else. It's about meeting someone you've been avoiding. My hands were shaking as I reached out. The fabric felt warm, like it had been waiting. As I changed, every movement felt like crossing an invisible line. I expected panic. Instead, something loosened. My shoulders dropped. My breathing slowed. When I looked at myself, I didn't see a costume. I saw relief. We didn't talk much after that. She guided me to sit, to notice sensations, emotions, memories. I felt exposed, but not in a fragile way. More like standing in sunlight after years indoors. Tears came without warning, not from shame, but from recognition. I told her things I had never told anyone. About pretending. About longing. About the quiet envy I felt watching people live honestly. She listened without judgment, like this version of me made sense. When the session ended, I expected it to end there. Clothes off. Back to normal. Temporary exercise. But as I reached to change back, my chest tightened again. The thought of removing them felt like losing language. She noticed. She always noticed. You don't have to rush, she said. Sometimes discovery asks us to sit longer than we planned. I left that day wearing the same clothes under my coat, heart racing, terrified someone would see, more terrified they wouldn't. That night, alone in my room, I stood in front of the mirror for hours. Not posing. Not imagining. Just existing. For the first time, the reflection didn't feel like a stranger. It felt like a secret finally letting me look at it directly. I told myself it was just therapy. Just an exercise. Just one step. But deep down, something had shifted. A door I had spent my life holding shut was now open a crack, and I didn't know if I had the strength or the desire to close it again. The next session felt different before it even began. I noticed it in my body first. The way my steps slowed outside her door. The way my hand hesitated before knocking, as if I already knew I was crossing deeper into something that couldn't be undone. I had spent the entire week in a strange in-between state, going through my normal routines while carrying a secret that felt alive inside me. At work I laughed at the right moments, nodded in meetings, answered emails, but every mirror reflected a question I couldn't silence anymore. Who was I performing for, And who was I betraying? When I entered the room, she looked at me differently. Not surprised. Not pleased. Just aware. She asked how the week had been, and I surprised myself by telling the truth. I told her I felt split, like two versions of me were negotiating for control. One terrified of being exposed, the other exhausted from hiding. She nodded and said something that made my throat tighten. That tension is often the moment before integration. I didn't know what that meant, but it sounded permanent. She asked me to repeat the role play. This time, there was no cabinet reveal, no dramatic pause. The clothes were already there, folded neatly, like they belonged. My hands moved with less fear and more reverence. As I changed, memories surfaced. Moments from childhood I had dismissed as irrelevant. Times I had been told to stop, to act normal, to not draw attention. I realized how early I had learned to compress myself, to lock certain feelings away not because they were wrong, but because they were inconvenient. We talked while I sat there, dressed in a way that made my body feel honest. She asked me to speak from that place, not about it. At first my voice shook, but then it steadied. I spoke about softness, about permission, about how I had always admired courage in others while practicing disappearance myself. The words came faster, clearer, like they had been waiting for this context to exist. Then she asked a question that felt like a test I hadn't studied for. What would happen if this wasn't temporary? My mind screamed objections. My family. My reputation. My safety. My future. I listed them all, one by one, as if logic could close the door again. She listened patiently, then said, "And what happens if it is temporary?" That's when I broke. Because I knew the answer. Going back felt like suffocation. Like knowing a truth and choosing silence anyway. The sessions continued, and with each one, the role-play expanded. Not into fantasy, but into reality. How I sat today. How I spoke. How I referred to myself. She wasn't directing me. She was removing obstacles. Every time I left her office, returning to my old presentation felt heavier, like armor I no longer needed but didn't know how to remove in public. I started noticing how much energy I had spent monitoring myself, editing gestures, lowering my voice, hardening my expression. One afternoon, she said something that made the room feel very small. At some point, therapy stops being a place you visit and becomes a life you choose. I asked her what she meant, even though I already understood. She explained that role play is meant to reveal patterns, but sometimes the pattern revealed isn't a role at all. It's a self. And once seen, it doesn't disappear. I started staying dressed longer after sessions. At first minutes. Then hours. Eventually, I went home that way. Each time I expected panic, and each time what I felt instead was calm. A quiet confidence I had never known. But peace came with fear. Because peace made me wonder what I had been missing all along, and whether I could ever go back to pretending ignorance. The final shift came when she said, gently but firmly, "We need to talk about what forever means to you." The word echoed in my head like a warning and a promise at the same time. Forever meant consequences. Forever meant visibility. Forever meant courage I wasn't sure I had. But it also meant authenticity. And for the first time in my life, authenticity felt less dangerous than the lie. I left that session knowing something irreversible had begun. Not because of clothes. Not because of labels. But because I had tasted what it felt like to live without apologizing to myself. And once you feel that, the old life doesn't feel like safety anymore. It feels like a cage you finally notice the bars of. After that session, the word forever followed me everywhere. It echoed in ordinary moments, in grocery store aisles, in traffic lights, in the quiet before sleep. I realized how often I had planned my life as if it were reversible, like I could always restart if something went wrong. But this felt different. This felt like choosing a direction knowing there was no secret exit. And that terrified me more than anything I had ever done. The changes didn't announce themselves loudly. They slipped in quietly, disguising themselves as small decisions. I stopped rushing to change the moment I got home. I started choosing clothes that felt gentle instead of rigid. I noticed how my body responded when I allowed myself softness instead of correcting it. The strangest part was how natural it felt, as if I wasn't learning something new, but remembering something old. Something I had set down years ago and never picked back up. In therapy, we stopped calling it role play. She said continuing to call it that was doing a disservice to the honesty of what was happening. We talked about grief then. Not the grief of losing my old self, but the grief of realizing how long I had abandoned parts of me to survive. I mourned the years I spent trying to earn acceptance by shrinking. I mourned the version of myself who believed love was conditional on performance. Telling other people became the next wall. Not a dramatic announcement, just quiet truths shared with trembling hands. The first person I told didn't respond the way I had rehearsed. There was confusion. Silence. A pause that felt endless. I learned in that moment that acceptance doesn't always arrive wrapped in reassurance. Sometimes it comes slowly, awkwardly, learning the shape of something new. That uncertainty hurt, but it didn't destroy me. And realizing that gave me strength I didn't know I had. There were setbacks. Days when fear won and I hid again. Days when I questioned everything and wondered if I was making a mistake that couldn't be undone. But even on those days, something had changed. Hiding felt like a choice now, not a rule. And that distinction mattered more than I expected. It meant I had agency. It meant I wasn't trapped. I was deciding. One session, she asked me to imagine my future self walking into the room. Not idealized. Not perfect. Just real. I closed my eyes and pictured someone calmer. Someone grounded. Someone who no longer flinched at their own reflection. When she asked what that version of me was wearing, I smiled without thinking. Because for once, the answer didn't feel symbolic. It felt practical. It felt lived in. The fear of permanence still lingered, but it started to change shape. It wasn't fear of becoming something anymore. It was fear of losing it. Losing the honesty. Losing the relief. Losing the quiet joy of alignment. I realized how backwards my old thinking had been. I had been afraid of changing forever, when the real tragedy would have been changing temporarily and then forcing myself back into silence. The final test came unexpectedly. A moment where I could have retreated completely, erased progress, returned to safety as I once defined it. No one would have blamed me. No one would have even known. I stood there, heart racing, weighing comfort against truth. And for the first time, I chose truth without negotiating with fear. It wasn't dramatic. It was simple. And that simplicity felt powerful. When I told my therapist what I had done, she didn't congratulate me. She didn't label it bravery. She just said, "That's what living from the inside out looks like." I realized then that therapy hadn't changed me. It had uncovered me. The clothes, the role play, the process were never the point. They were tools. Mirrors. Invitations. Forever no longer sounded like a threat. It sounded like continuity. Like waking up each day without splitting myself into acceptable and hidden parts. Like being tired for normal reasons instead of emotional labor. I knew there would still be challenges, misunderstandings, moments of doubt. But I also knew something unshakable now. I could survive honesty. And more than that, I could live inside it. The only question left was how fully I was willing to step into the life I had finally admitted was mine. The last session didn't feel like an ending, which surprised me. I had imagined something ceremonial, a closing statement, maybe even a goodbye to the version of me that first walked into that room unable to breathe. Instead, it felt ordinary, calm, grounded. And that was how I knew the transformation was real. Drama had been replaced by presence. I arrived already dressed the way I now lived most days. Not as an experiment. Not as courage on display. Just as myself. She noticed, of course. She always did. But she didn't comment right away. We talked about daily things first. Sleep. Work. Boundaries. The kind of conversations that only happen when identity stops being the crisis and starts being the foundation. And that realization hit me hard. This was no longer about discovery. This was about maintenance. About living. At one point, she asked me to reflect on the first day. on how tight my chest had been, how I had braced myself for rejection even in a space designed for safety. I felt a wave of compassion for that earlier version of me. Not embarrassment. Not regret. Compassion. I realized healing had changed the way I looked backward too. The past no longer felt like proof of failure. It felt like evidence of survival. I asked her a question I had been holding on to quietly. Whether therapy had crossed a line. Whether encouraging permanence was dangerous. She met my eyes and answered carefully. She said therapy doesn't create identities. It creates conditions where truth can surface. What someone does with that truth is their responsibility, not the therapist's agenda. Then she said something I will carry forever. You didn't stay because I dressed you. You stayed because you recognized yourself. Walking out of that office for the last time, I felt something I had never associated with myself before. Continuity. No mental switching. No internal negotiations. Just oneself moving through the world. Outside, life went on exactly as it always had. Cars passed. People talked. No thunder. No spotlight. And yet everything was different, because I was no longer fragmented inside it. There were still hard conversations ahead. Still moments of misunderstanding. Still days when the world reminded me that authenticity isn't always rewarded. But those challenges felt external now, not internal. I wasn't fighting myself anymore. And that changed the scale of everything. Sometimes people ask when it stopped being role play. I tell them the truth. It stopped the moment I stopped counting sessions. The moment I stopped planning an end. The moment I realized I wasn't rehearsing a life. I was living one. Forever didn't arrive all at once. It arrived quietly, through repetition, through choosing honesty on ordinary days. I no longer think of my therapist as the person who changed me. I think of her as the person who gave me permission to stop abandoning myself. The clothes were never the story. The story was courage. The story was listening. The story was finally trusting that the version of me I had hidden wasn't something to be fixed, but something to be lived. And if this sounds dramatic, if it sounds extreme, I understand. I once would have thought the same. But transformation doesn't always announce itself with noise. Sometimes it happens the moment you realize you're done pretending tomorrow will be the day you start being real. For me, that day already passed. And I never took the costume off, because it was never a costume at all.